And there's nobody better to unpack this than international theorist, expert, John Mearsheimer, professor, and just all-around incredible guy. Professor, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here, Danny.
Well, listen, I hope you're sitting down and you got something to hold on to, because I don't want your head to start spinning with a lot of this information I'm going to be throwing at you today, because it's a tough one for to even make sense of, much less just to watch with a straight face. But let's get into it first of all here. So President Zelensky just yesterday released a statement that makes it sound like he's just getting ready to go on to continue war.
I began today with a report on the work of the air defense, the completion of our warriors' training, and the deployment of patriots in Ukraine. We have already quite thoroughly planned our work with foreign audiences for August and September. Meetings and negotiations, participation in summits. Ukraine will get everything it needs to withstand and achieve its goals.
Okay, so, I mean, we'll just start with the contradictions in the single statement right there. On the one hand, he's saying we're going to get everything we need to attain our goals, which he doesn't specify which goals he's talking about. But then right before that, he's talking about we're going to have meetings and negotiations, not talking about what he's going to negotiate. And then before that, he's talking about we're continuing to prepare all of our military. So what do you make of that mess he just said right there?
Well, first of all, I don't know how many patriots he's going to get, but it's not going to make any difference. The fact is that Ukraine doesn't have the necessary air defenses to keep the Russians from bombing all across their country. And there is no evidence, none, that the West is going to be able to provide them with the necessary air defenses. So it's hard to know what he's talking about. And by the way, we can get into this in more detail. If you look at the effect of Russian air power and Russian missiles and Russian drones on what's happening in Ukraine, it is really having a profound effect. So not having those air defense missiles really matters. With regard to negotiations and dealing with the West to deal with this problem and that problem, it's all basically a waste of time. What the Ukrainians need is they need manpower, and they don't have that, and they're not going to get that. And they need weaponry, and they don't have enough of that, and they're not going to get that. So all of this is beside the point. And Zelensky is, he's making good comments for public relations purposes, but in terms of making substantive comments that really are telling us something about where the war is headed, he's not doing that.
And, and I think to tag on about the air defenses, I know that especially during the NATO summit, there was a lot of more claims that we were going to give them more defense or batteries, et cetera, to use. But the big problem is the long pole in the tent for Ukraine, really for everybody, is that there's not enough interceptor missiles in our manufacturing capacity. While a little higher than it was, it's still not a fraction enough to be able to provide enough interceptors, no matter how many batteries they have. And as you pointed out just now, I mean, the missiles from Russia are already getting through all over the country, but there's almost no stopping, especially the FAB bombs and the glide bombs of Russia on the front line, which are all launched from their aircraft, and almost none of those get interdicted.
Yeah, and it's also important to emphasize that if they get Patriot missiles or any other significant air defense systems, the Russians will take them out. That's what they've been doing. They've been taking out the Patriots. What we've seen in this war, to sort of elevate the conversation a bit to a more general level, is that we give the Ukrainians sophisticated weapons. They work for a while, and then the Russians come up with appropriate countermeasures and basically neutralize those weapons. In fact, if you think about ATACMS, you don't hear much about ATACMS attacks on Russia these days, and that fits the general pattern. So they can give them Pershings if they scrape them up, but it's just not going to matter in the final analysis.
Yeah, I mean, the same with HIMARS before that, and and for a while it was going to be the Challenger tanks and the ones, the M1s from the United States, the Bradleys, the Strykers, all those things, and yet you don't hear about them anymore. And nobody ever goes back and wonders what's going to happen next. And of course, the next one coming in is going to be the F-16. That's going to be the big savior that's going to happen, or so they claim.
Well, I don't think that's the case at all. And in fact, there was this very important interview with General Syrski, who is the commanding general of the Ukrainian military, in The Guardian, the British newspaper, recently. And he made it clear that the F-16s really don't matter. They're not going to have any meaningful effect on the battlefield. First of all, they're only going to get about 20 of them in the first batch. And I think more important than the F-16 are the pilots. And I do not believe for 1 second that they have skilled pilots who can fly those 20 F-16s.
Yeah.
But let's assume I'm wrong and they have skilled pilots and they get 20 F-16s. If they go near the Russian air defenses, here we're talking about the most formidable ground-based air defenses in the world, and also the fact that the Russians have a lot of aircraft that can be used in a counter-air role. They're going to cut those 20 F-16s to doll rags. So Syrski made it clear that we're not going to send them up to the front, the F-16s. And Syrski's not going to send them up close to the front because he knows they will be
shot down.
Doll rags. So the F-16s are not going to matter. More Pershings are not going to matter. The Ukrainians are basically in truly deep trouble on the battlefield.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's the personnel is the biggest shortfall, because maybe they can get some weapons and maybe they can get some more ammunition, although probably not in the numbers that they're required. But nobody's going to give them people, and they're just running short on people.
You know, it's very interesting in this regard, Danny. When the Ukrainians put into place this new mobilization plan about 2 months ago, there was talk at the time of creating 10 new Ukrainian brigades. Yeah. And that, of course, sounded like a really good idea. If you're the Ukrainians, you're in deep trouble. 10 new brigades would really help. It turns out that they are not creating any new brigades, that the existing brigades, battalions, and what have you on the front lines are suffering such egregious casualties that they're taking the troops that would have otherwise gone into those 10 brigades, and they're force feeding them into the frontline troop units that are in desperate need of manpower. And of course, they're sending forward people who are not well trained. So those people are dying in large numbers, and at the same time, you're not getting 10 new brigades. So in terms of manpower, the Ukrainians are in absolutely terrible shape.
And, you know, it's also interesting, John, because I want to say it was about a month ago, there was a report out or a quote out, actually, by, I don't recall if it was Syrski or one of the other generals, but they said, hey, listen, we've got, you know, personnel for 10 new brigades coming out, but we don't have any weapons to outfit them west. So this was heading into the NATO summit. So they were saying, hey, we need a lot more weapons and tools of war, the equipment, vehicles. I mean, all the things that go along with that to equip these 10 brigades. And that's a lot of kit. And I haven't seen anyone step up and say that they're going to fill that request, even if they had the personnel, which, as you pointed out, now then they're already having to divert them away. So without 10 brigades worth of equipment being promised and delivered, and now they're without the personnel, on what basis do you want to continue fighting?
Just very quickly, in an ideal world, you would take that equipment that you were just talking about and you would create mechanized infantry brigades and armored brigades. But in fact, what they were talking about doing is creating straight leg infantry brigades. These are not mechanized infantry brigades because they simply didn't have the weaponry. They didn't have the Bradleys, they didn't have the tanks, they didn't have the mobile artillery, and so forth and so on. So they were talking about straight leg infantry divisions for the most part, maybe an airborne division or two. But those, brigade, not division, but those brigades have not materialized. That's the point. And of course, the weaponry is not materialized. So you raised the question, what's the point of continuing the fighting? There's a very simple answer to that question. There's no point in continuing the fighting. It would make eminently good sense for the Ukrainians to try to shut this war down immediately. They're not going to turn it around. More Ukrainians are going to die, and they're going to lose more territory. This is, from my point of view, nonsensical.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I understand a portion. I understand the emotional component of the Ukrainians to not want to go down that path. But I think that the train has long ago left the station to where reality has to crush in on that. Otherwise, you're only going to cause yourself more casualties than is necessary. One of the things that may be that perhaps that is part of what's animating Zelensky to say, hey, let's talk about maybe having more of a negotiated settlement. The foreign minister Kuleba just went to Beijing to talk peace about with the Chinese, and Zelensky also yesterday talked about how that played out. Watch this.
There is a clear signal that China supports Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. It was also confirmed what Chinese leader Xi Jinping told me, that China will not supply weapons to Russia.
Okay, funny thing about that, I looked at the Chinese response to that. Gary, if you can throw that up there. And I read through what they wrote from their public side there. This is on the Global Times. Their headline is that slanders against China over Ukraine crisis fall apart. But when you look down through it, when they're talking about the meeting itself, there is no mention about anything in there about territorial integrity or that they're on Ukraine's side or that they would turn against Russia or anything. In fact, the only thing it did say is that the Chinese side advocated an immediate ceasefire and a negotiated settlement, which they said it was a long time coming to get this war started and it'll be a long time negotiating a way out. But they left it with the parties to figure out only that they advocate a peaceful resolution to the war. So I'm not sure that Ukraine's going to have a lot of success there getting China on their side.
Yeah, I think there's no question the Chinese are not going to side with the Ukrainians against the Russians. My gut instinct is that what Zelensky was doing here was he was talking to the Chinese and feeling them out to see what kind of assistance they might provide Ukraine in the negotiations. And maybe he was looking to see whether the Chinese might act as mediators in the negotiations. But I think when I see Zelensky talking to the Chinese, he's not so much concerned about how the Chinese are affecting events on the battlefield in a direct way by, say, providing weaponry to the Russians. I think he's much more interested in trying to figure out how he and the Ukrainians more generally can negotiate themselves out of this disastrous situation they're in, and thinking that maybe the Chinese can help them on the margins.
And do you see any room for that? I mean, why? Because I've got to put myself in the role of the Chinese, and I'm thinking now you are definitely, Vladimir Putin has now met with Xi Jinping a couple of times, not very far apart. They're obviously increasing their strategic relations and their economic discussions, helping other areas like dual use technology, for example. So what benefit does Ukraine have to do anything that's counter to the Russian side that would be positive for the Ukraine side? What's their motivation? What would it be?
Well, from the point of view of trying to settle this one, what really has to be done is the Ukrainians have to come to terms with the fact that they have to give up the 4 oblasts and Crimea. And Russia, of course, has annexed all 4 of those oblasts plus Crimea. And the Ukrainians have to come to terms with the fact that not only can they not join NATO, they cannot have a meaningful security relationship with the West, especially the United States. That's what has to be done. And once they do that, then they might be able to talk to the Chinese to get the Chinese to help put pressure on the Russians to not take more territory. See, the interesting question going forward is how much more territory the Russians are going to take in addition to these 4 oblasts plus Crimea.